Good morning. Welcome to the live Daily Self-Mastery series. Today I'm bringing together several closely related ideas: self-mastery, deep practice, and identity visualization. It's a wrap-up event to bring together where we've been so far over the last 3 months, and then in the next 2 months we're shifting from self-mastery to leadership. We started with crushing anxiety, 2 months of self-mastery, and now we're getting into leadership, first one-to-one and then one-to-many. And this serves as an anchor point where people can go back and watch this self-mastery series, because until you get there, it's an iterative process, which I'll talk about. Now, they're not separate concepts. They're parts of the same system. This conversation matters now more than ever because the pace of change isn't just fast. It's accelerating, and accelerating exponentially. Complexity is compounding across technology, markets, organizations, and personal roles. The problem isn't disruption itself, it's that the baseline keeps moving. When the mean is shifting, passivity is no longer neutral. It quietly pushes you off course, and that's what's happening. At the same time, something else shifted quietly over the last few decades. We moved from a world that rewarded over-preparation and planning for perfect execution to one that rewards iteration, refinement, and tight feedback loops to produce excellent outcomes. Execution still matters, but now it lives inside feedback, not certainty. I'll refer to this as the importance of feedback loops. Self-mastery may sound familiar, but what most people think it is, isn't. For years, we were taught implicitly or explicitly that personality, intelligence, and identity were largely fixed. Improvement meant learning more information and hoping it showed up when needed. What changed wasn't motivation or culture. What changed was our understanding of how the brain and behavior actually adapt, and why most change efforts fail under pressure. Self-mastery isn't about hacks, trends, or temporary boosts. It's about installing reliable patterns that hold up when conditions are unstable. This is why I refer to it as even when there's chaos all around us. Most people already know what to do. The real gap is execution when it matters. Knowing and not doing is functionally the same as not knowing. This is why the 4 pillars of self-mastery exists. They aren't personality traits or philosophy. They're control surfaces, practical levers that shape regulation, identity, habits, and recovery speed. And recovery speed is much more important than people think. What looks like being regulated is actually a series of micro recoveries, often happening at the millisecond level. When trained well, recovery becomes automatic. That's where deep practice comes in, not visualization as wishful thinking, not motivation. Deep practice is true mental rehearsal, training the nervous system itself, where habits reside. Under pressure, we don't rise to intention, we fall back to what's wired. Deep practice changes what's wired. What people call muscle memory is really nervous system memory, myelinated neural pathways, the same mechanism elite performers use under speed and uncertainty applies to decision making, emotional regulation, communication, and leadership. Identity visualization completes the loop. In fast-changing environments, trying to visualize a fixed destination too early creates pressure, not progress. Identity visualization isn't about titles or outcomes. It's rehearsing who you are becoming, your default responses, emotional regulation, and standards. It's a representation of what that identity looks like that might be 2 years away, but what that allows you to do is stabilize that 2-year period while you're working towards it, instead of feeling like you're not there yet and things aren't working. Early progress is often internal and quiet. Habits are forming, recovery is speeding up, and identity is stabilizing before there's visible momentum. This phase is easy to rush, especially when others ask, "What are you going to do?" or "Have you finished it yet? Do you have anything to show yet?" Premature answers force premature decisions. When identity and regulation strengthen, direction clarifies. Pivots stop feeling like collapses. Action comes from agency instead of reaction. That's self-mastery, not perfection, reliability, not permanent calm, faster return, and progress that you can access starting today, because we'll talk about the levers and the drivers. As we move forward, pay attention to the feedback loops, not at the outcome level, but at the micro level, where what looks like composure, clarity, or confidence is usually a series of rapid micro recoveries. The work isn't avoiding disruption, it's shortening the loop between stimulus, recovery, and the next best action. Some observations to connect the dots. What feels like constant presence is usually rapid recovery, not emotional control. Most high performers aren't calm because nothing hits them. They're calm because the reset happens fast enough to be invisible to the eye. Most performance breakdowns aren't effort problems. They're late intervention problems. By the time people try to manage their state, the nervous system has already committed to a default. I'll show you how that works. Now, when sequencing is right, reliability replaces the need to chase efficiency. You don't need to optimize every move when the handoff from perception to action is trained. This idea of sequencing is so important. There's in the book, Before You Know It by John Barsh, he does studies on the subconscious, and this goes back 20 or 30 years, and it's long been defined that it's more a network of neurons, it's not a mind. But because he's in the neuroscience field, they're still calling it, at least for the published works, they still refer to it as subconscious mind because there's so much traction in history behind that term. But anyway, he talks about this research where you may have seen this thing where they prime the subjects in a certain way and it influences the outcome on an exam. Well, some researchers got curious and said, I wonder what would happen if we combined two stereotypes that are deeply embedded in the US and put them together, what would happen? And so they came up with this idea to use teenage Asian American girls. The reason for that was that in this culture, in the US culture, girls are thought not to be as good at math as boys. And it's also thought that Asians are better at math than Americans. So when they combined them, they were curious about what would happen. What turned out was interesting. When you prime both ethnicity and gender in the information, as the person's putting in their name, etc., and what ethnicity and what gender, what mattered, and it mattered dramatically, was priming. Which one came first? Sequencing. When they sequenced the Asian, the ethnicity first, they did better on the math exams. When they asked gender first, they did worse on the exams. This changes the complexion of all of these various research projects that showed how you can prime somebody into a bad result. Not only does it impact the subject, but you may remember the one where the teachers were told that the kids in these two rows are the smart kids, in these two rows are the slower kids. And it was random. It was totally random, but that's what they told the teacher, and sure enough, the grades reflected what the teacher was told, even though it wasn't even true. The sad thing is that much of this is used by bad actors. I mean, it just makes sense. There's always going to be bad actors, there's good and evil, etc. But these con men rely on essentially priming. They prime you into seeing certain things a certain way. They kind of say, look over here because this is important, and over here is the steps and the priming that they need you to fall into. So that's a little bit out of scope, but I wanted to make that point so that people can see how powerful this is, and more importantly, how we can use it. We shouldn't be letting ourselves get used by this or abused by this kind of work. We need to be exercising agency and personal leadership every day, and you'll see it's not just every day, it's every hour, every minute, and I'm telling you, even at the millisecond level. And while you may think that's not possible, that's what the world believed for decades. It's very possible, and I'll illustrate that today. First, what I want to do is give you some examples just to kind of frame this a little bit, and I'm going to do it in the context of we're moving from this to this. This picture here is on the cover of the book Changing World Order. And the reason I use the book Changing World Order is not that I'm suggesting that you follow this or that this becomes what you believe and track to. It's because it's my backdrop. I like to have large cycles, and these cycles tend to be 80 years, and give or take. So, and these represent economic cycles that the world has been going through, and it's been going on for a while. Now this is where we are now, and it's at the end of the page, and that's fine. This is the U.S., and we're at that point. We're at somewhere in stage 5 of a 6-stage cycle. So you have to rise, where all you have to do is show up, and everything is better. If in business, you show up, you get promoted. You show up, you get sales. Everything just worked, and the infrastructure was there, and the U.S. became a production powerhouse. And as we started topping, we started offshoring that. And this is that, you've seen various studies of how people go from strong, cultures go from strong to weak, and then they not disappear, but then they have to get replaced by the strong again. And I may not be saying that right, but the point is, the U.S. replaced Great Britain, and Great Britain replaced the Dutch. So these were past world superpowers. And the Dutch replaced Spain and Portugal. And Spain and Portugal replaced the Ottoman Empire, which was multiple entities. So Spain and Portugal, you had two sharing that world power, and that's an important point. Then you had the Dutch, and if you think about the Dutch and Great Britain, they had great navies, and they were all over the world. They have islands. You go to the Virgin Islands, there's Dutch, there's French islands, there's British islands, and these folks were colonizing all over the world, but Great Britain and Dutch were the big players in that regard. Currency tended to go along with the world superpower. It made sense, especially if you're colonizing. Those islands are going to use the Dutch guilder. Or in the case of Great Britain, they were using the pound sterling. In the case of Spain and Portugal, they were using the Spanish pesos. And in the case of the United States, it's the USD. And the reason this is significant is what's going on now. When you look at this updated view, this is the U.S. If we're about here in stage 5, it's a 6 stages. We're somewhere in here, and you have China is the rising one. Now, when you have this conversation and you do it in this context, if I show China and the U.S., people react with a patriotic point of view that, but China can't do that and China can't do this, and they lose the narrative. The important part of the narrative that, wait a minute, the U.S. is in decline. The world, the U.S. dollar is at risk of losing its position as the world reserve currency. Meanwhile, China has been spearheading the BRICS currency, and there are others, not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There are others trading in that BRICS currency as well, because for decades the U.S. dollar was there was a thing called the concept of the petrodollar, and all oil was being traded in the U.S. dollar. So since oil kind of makes the world go round, all these countries were using dollars. But as this gets replaced, there's a question of what's going to happen. We don't know. I do believe that this is my narrative, what I use, is that something like this, because we don't know, that's what we think China's going to do, and this is what it looks like the U.S. is going to do. So that should be a dotted line, because that's what it looks like is going to happen. Trends tend to stay in place until they change, and trends are resistant. But I also think that there's the possibility, just like here, where you had a multipolar environment. And if we have a multipolar environment, you could have the U.S., a scenario with the U.S. and China, but also what's going on is there's others that are coming into play. So, and because of the speed of technology and the amount of volatility around the world, you could very easily see a third entity joining into this multipolar environment. In addition to this, in 1970, we said that the technology capability is going to double every 18 months. It's Moore's Law, Intel chief. The idea was capacity. The chips, they were able to make the chips smaller and smaller and smaller while increasing the capacity. So the chips had greater computing power and they were getting smaller, hence going from a computer that took up a whole room to a computer that's more powerful than that one, and it fits in your pocket. And if you look at an exponential type curve, it stays shallow, then it's increasing, and somewhere around 10 doublings, it starts to get steep. But if you look at this in the context of 30 doublings, this part looks shallow, and the last part looks steep. The last part is always steep because you're doubling half of the end number. So if you take $1,000 and double it 10 times, it turns into $1 million. The fifth year, the fifth doubling, it's 32,000. So you can see why that last part of it is steep, because it goes from 512,000 to 1,024,000. But if you take that, as I said, and extend it over 30 doublings, that part looks flat. And keep that in mind as you think about this. We are on a very steep part of this curve. So how many doublings have we had from and I mean, who knows if this has actually tracked? It was originally every 12 months, then it was shifted to every 18 months. Who knows what it is now, but let's just say it's still even if it's every 2 years, right? Even if it's doubling every 2 years, that's like 30 doublings. You can see that in how artificial intelligence 5 years ago was hundreds of billions of dollars to create. Now, AI systems are being created with tens of millions. And these early investors would love to have a way to get their money out. And this is why you see a rush to try different things for AI. Unfortunately, it's turning into some bad stuff. We're seeing the deep fakes. You're not going to get almost $1 trillion of investment out of deep fakes. And like many technology solutions, they start out with great intentions. What actually ends up happening is something very different. Technology showed up its productivity when you had things like Airbnb and Uber, but in the beginning, what they thought would be done, it wasn't. Of course, e-commerce is a big one. Amazon is a big example, but those took time to evolve, and artificial intelligence will do the same thing. It will be used. I don't know if it's going to be robots in every home, but whatever it is, the bigger point is this is very steep, this technology curve. So why am I focusing on this? It's my backdrop that because of the tech curve and the changing world order, which is inevitable, whatever you want to believe, something's going to happen. The one thing that's constant is change. Rapid change, accelerating change, and exponentially accelerating change. And that's why self-mastery is more important than ever. I would say it's always been important, but you've been able to get away with not having your game, not being on your game in the past, because it was slow. Things were slow, and there was a lot of stability in infrastructure. You think going from agriculture to industrial, they were so infrastructure based that it took a long time. And that's kind of what's happening with AI. In the beginning, AI was very infrastructure dependent, data centers, etc. Now it's more algorithm dependent. Of course, they're leveraging some of the early work, but it's moving from needing data centers to more about the algorithm, and chips are the big thing. Who knows where it's going next? Whatever happens, as a person who's in this world, what you don't want to have happen is to end up like the Matrix. I think the Matrix does a good job of depicting how it can look, because when you have artificial intelligence sending out messaging, doing your ad copy, writing your books, your ebooks and all that, what is it using? It's using the past, and it's using what worked. So everything is in there, whether it's cons or ad copy that gets people to buy stuff they'll never need. All of that is in the learning of AI, and that's being applied. And you may feel it now. I know 5 years ago, I'd read where we are hit with 5,000 ad stimuli per day. Now it's lately, the few years ago, I saw 10,000. Who knows what it is now? And that's only going to increase. So people won't, you're not going to stop the number of ad stimuli. But what self-mastery does is it builds in a focus, so you actually end up ignoring many of those stimuli, not because you could suppress them, not because you avoid them, but because of how the nervous system works. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I mentioned we're going to do a quick from and to, just to solidify that when you think about getting stressed out, and it looks something like you have a rise, then a peak, and then a return to back to presence. Then you have a rise and a peak and a back to presence. Sometimes you have a rise and it stays there for a long period of time, and eventually you come back to presence. We want to go from that to this. This is like getting on the roller coaster only to come back to the beginning. And these are, you could think of these as recoveries, but these are recoveries at the conscious level. These are recoveries at a slow level. This is slow recovery. This is rapid recovery. You're not going to make that change overnight, but in 6 months you can definitely make that shift. We're going to go from kind of a comfort zone that looks like this. You have an upper limit and a lower limit, to something that's like this. While everybody else is in this comfort zone, not everybody else, you're going to do this. And you're going to rise, just like in Good to Great, where he identified the organizations that made this inflection point. They outperformed the other companies that were similar, and they did so for 15 years. And that was the litmus test, or the threshold, to get into Good to Great. And then some of these companies fell off in the 2008 crisis, and he looked at the ones that stayed, and he came out with Great by Choice. So this was Good to Great, and this was Great by Choice. And those are good principles to follow if you're a business owner. And it gets to habits. When he talks about the different things that made this work, they're habits that can be developed. So this, we're going from this to this, from a slow recovery to rapid recovery. And this is why self-mastery is possible. In the 70s and 80s, I remember using this diagram a lot, where we said that, yeah, rising is like this. You go up, these are different color to keep it separate. You go up and then down. And from this peak, you can see the next peak, but you can't see the next one. You get to this peak, you go down, and then you go to the next peak, and then people get tired. People get tired of this because this gets more and more costly. Think about it. As you have more, you're going to risk more, and you don't want to take those big risks. And we end up slowing down at one of these peaks. This is how I think it happens when you don't have self-mastery, and we want to go from that to this. Yes, there is a dip in transformation, but this dip in transformation is like a foundation, building a foundation, and from there you do more of this. So this line is really like this line. You break out, you build a foundation, you break out, and then you can keep rising, but you don't have to go through these valleys. And that's an important point. Now, to bring this home, and then I'll explain it, I'll have slides where you can do screenshots. Big difference, and this is so hard for people to grasp because there's not literature out there that supports it, and so there's no tapes to hang it on. And when you go back and try to match it up to your experience, your past associations come in. We have 100 billion neurons, and each of those neurons is connected to anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. And because of that, associations can be from anything. You could be walking down a path and see some flowers, and those are the same kind of flowers you saw when you broke up with your partner. And those flowers create this tension inside, this anxiety, and you don't attach it to the flowers because you immediately associate it to breaking up. And now you're thinking about the breakup, and you're wondering what they're doing, and then you're mad about that, and the person you're with right then and there is getting the brunt of it, and they did nothing. And then the crazy thing that happens because of these associations, and people believe that the network of neurons is a mind, and if the network of neurons is a mind, that means it's you. And if it's you, that means, falsely, that it's true. But it's not true. It's associations from the past. They're representations. And if you consider from a hunter-gatherer standpoint, this is an evolution that's been going on for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And in that evolution, this made sense because you're in the field, you're in the out in the wild, you have animals and enemies and all that, and so it made sense to be doing things by habit. And you relied on that. It kept you alive. And by the way, this conditioning was happening at age 0 to 7. Age 0 to 7, we had that conditioning, and the world is completely different. I don't care if you're 30 or 60. It's so different from what it was when you were 0 to 7. And then we have the conscious mind. And this is where we live. This is where we rationalize. This is where we make sense of the world. So the reason why I say we think it's true and it's not is because when this receives the message, the conscious mind, it assumes it to be true, it's real, and it acts as though it's real because it's how we've survived. The network of neurons on this side is fast, it's parallel, multiple at running at the same time, and it's non-linear. And over here, it's slow. The conscious mind is slow. It's sequential, and it's linear. The big difference, and this is why when you see this and start connecting the dots, this process is at 11 million bits per second. This process is at 50 bits per second. This is why rapid recovery looks like steady state, and slow recovery looks like peaks and valleys. And what we're going to do is, through this process that I'm talking about, so there's a handoff here, obviously, right? There's a handoff that goes, it transitions from from neural pathways to conscious thought. And it could be conscious thought, it could be feelings, it could be bodily sensations, it could be pictures, it could be ideas. But what we're going to do is reduce, when it comes to these peaks and valleys, we're going to reduce the amplitude, we're going to reduce the frequency, and we're going to reduce the duration. By doing that, you're going to go from this to this. Where this was measured in hours, days, and weeks, sometimes longer, this is measured at the best case in milliseconds. You'll see seconds, first you'll see minutes, then you'll see seconds. Seconds is when you're aware of it, and then when it's happening at the millisecond level, you're not aware of it, but your results change, your outcomes change. So that is a backdrop, and I wanted to connect some of the dots and use that backdrop as we go through the slides. And I'll go through these fairly quickly because this is a wrap up, and I've covered this, and you can go back and look at some other videos on the same platform, wherever you are. I go live daily on Facebook and YouTube and weekly on LinkedIn. 7 performance areas is the roadmap. This is a coaching model, so it's not something that you're going to be doing all the time, but as if you're coaching someone, we're looking at this mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional as the first hurdle. We've got to get across that hurdle because we have to have agency when there's nothing going on around us. If we don't have agency when we're by ourselves and there's nothing else around us, you're going to have a hard time getting agency when you're going after relationship, professional, and financial because other people are involved in that. And the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence, this is all foundational for dynamic leadership. You really can't do dynamic leadership unless you have this rapid recovery, this agency and personal leadership. So it's not about suppressing and you don't get knocked off course. It's just that you recover so quickly, it never looks like you've gotten knocked off course. We've all seen people go from a growth mindset to a fixed mindset, and sometimes they stay there for a long time. This is about noticing that you're shifting to fixed and correcting it right away. You don't have to wait because we can do it at the nervous system level. We can build in the habit. But I put this slide up there because emotional intelligence has some great work in it, and I don't take anything from it. As a matter of fact, it's also one of the pillars, or supports one of the pillars of dynamic leadership. But when emotional intelligence was created in the mid-90s, it was thought that personality, intelligence, identity, these things don't change. It was thought that we cannot change, that your team cannot change. And so there are people I work with today who learn emotional intelligence, and they're pretty committed that you can't change. So this conversation becomes interesting because you have to change these beliefs. The reason they believed you couldn't change was because when it was developed, we didn't have the view, the scanning tools to have the view of what the network of neurons are doing and the synapses and how that's where habit lies. And that's not a mind, it's a network of neurons. While energy is what's flowing through those neural pathways, the actual neural pathways are physiological. So I call it a neurobiological event. It's a physiological phenomena. The neurons and neural pathways, when the person dies, those stay here. The energy that's going through it is what's gone. But because the way they wrap with myelin, the path of least resistance is where the habits form. And self-mastery is the self-awareness and self-management, and then the leadership one-to-one, which I'll be covering in February, and leadership one-to-many I'll be covering in March. So that's your team leads and your executive leadership. The 7-step reset. The first step is the knowledge. What do we know? You have to understand neuroplasticity, beliefs, priming, mindset, physiology, and how all these impact your state. These are levers. These, I should say, drivers. These are major drivers for your state. So you want to have enough knowledge there, a baseline. You're not going to have to be an expert. You need a baseline so that you can use those drivers to maintain a constant state here. This is where your recovery happens. This step 2 comes before the conditioned reaction, which comes before the response. And we're going through this 33,000 times a day on average. And call 31,500 of them habitual patterns. So this is repeating over and over every other second, assuming you're awake 65,000 seconds a day. So this step 2 is getting back to what I call that recovered state, that presence, that mindfulness, that ability, that adaptability, where you can jump into the next one. When this is coherence, think of it as a high heart rate variability. The higher the heart rate variability, the more access you have to your capabilities. Coherence, when you're coherent, you don't have the chaos and the rigidity. This is what makes it easy to meet the moment when you get the condition, when you get the stimulus. And then that is separate from the response, and that's a big deal for me, because if you let your response equal your reaction, you're essentially in a triggered state, and it can escalate. And then steps 5, this is emotional modulation. We also build that in at the habit level, so now you modulate your emotions automatically. You don't have to wait. It's not regulating after the fact. We don't let the emotion ever lodge, but it's not that we don't let it lodge through suppression. We don't let it lodge by processing it. Energy and motion, that's emotion, right? Energy and motion, and we allow it to flow through us. When you suppress it, it gets stuck. And then action, do it, delegate it, delay it, or dump it. And then step 7 is return to presence. So 7, 1, and 2, that's where your rapid recovery comes from. 7, 1, and 2, over and over. 7, 1, and 2. This is what I was talking about. This is what I drew. So this is the network of neurons side. This is the conscious mind side. It's about a second. Call it a quarter, 3/4 of a second to a second. I like to make it a second because I want that 1/4 of a second pause. A 1/4 of a second pause is nothing, but because the network of neurons goes so fast, in that 1/4 of a second, you can process 2 million bits of information. So that 1/4 of a second is valuable. It doesn't gain you anything to rush through that. And when you're triggered, this side collapses, and this can be happening in a 1/4 of a second over here because you're freaking out. This is what's going on with the phobia. And this collapses, and now you can go from pre-listening all the way to action in less than a second, which is where you get these bad responses. And, I say you build trust on an escalator going up, but sometimes you can lose it like you're falling out the window. This pre-listening is before the stimulus. This green star is the stimulus. This pre-listening is going on, call it about 1/10 of a second, and it's always going on. And this is why sequencing is so important. When you get the sequencing right, speed doesn't matter. Too often people are focusing on speed and doing it right. But if you get the priming right, like I used that example where you had the Asian American girls, when you sequenced gender first, they did worse on the math test, and when you sequenced ethnicity first, they did better on the math test. And then the researchers said, but wait a minute, these were teenagers. What would happen if you went to before 4th grade? Same thing happened. And then they even did it earlier than that. I think they went to 3rd grade or something, 2nd or 3rd grade. But the point is, this is at the network of neuron level, and you're conditioning already from 0 to 7. So that little child is picking up from their environment. They're picking up those stereotypes even though they don't understand what they are. They're just picking it up. It's the same way you learn language. But that's what's going on, and that's why we shift the focus of mastery from the conscious side to building it in at the habit level. When you build it in at the habit level, it's automaticity. That's why we get that steady, rapid recovery to the millisecond level and not these peaks and valleys. So why this matters now? What changed is not motivation, right? It's how we understand what we understand about adaptability. It's not identity and intelligence that they're not fixed. Today we know behavior and wiring adapt with practice, and we're going to get into deep practice and how to make those changes. So mental rehearsal is part of it. And there's different kinds of visualization. You can take a screenshot of that if you want, but it gets to, I put this slide up here in the next one to put a point around, there's different kinds of visualization for different strategies, targets, outcomes. And if you have trouble getting visualization to work, it could be you're mismatching the kind of visualization with the desired outcome. And a good example is outcome visualization versus process visualization. Outcome would be the end result. Maybe if I'm speaking, right, the outcome visualization would be a standing ovation. The process innovation would be me working through answering questions and repeating the question before answering it. That would be something I would visualize. Now you can apply implementation intentions, which is a lever, but you apply implementation intentions with visualization at the process level. There's also overcoming obstacles, and this gets caught up in people think, well, I have to visualize the obstacle. And you have, I don't want to go too deep here, but there is a big difference in identity visualization because there's nothing to hang your hat on. I made the comment that we're going from these climbing peaks to building a foundation, and that foundation is like one big dip because you have to work through that. Changing the identity is part of that foundation, but also making the shifts, resetting your conditioning. So there's a big drop there, but then you come back up. It's like Tetris. If you're the game of Tetris, the player is able to match the blocks, and the blocks all work, and it works, and the lines are going down, and it looks like the player's going to win, and then all of a sudden you get a line or two, and they stick, and 4 lines stick, and 8 lines stick, and if you're the game, that wall just gets built because most of that time was the foundation. There's I think it's bamboo that goes for 7 years, 6 years, you don't see anything, and then the 7th year it just shoots up. It gets all that growth in 1 year, but it's been building roots in the foundation. Many examples that we can use. The point here is that while you're going through that foundation, while you're going through that dip, we want to be visualizing a steady state at the outcome, and it has to be a representation because like I said, everything is changing so fast. What are you going to visualize? Well, you can visualize this steady state outcome that represents that you've arrived at your purpose or whatever that is, the quest. And that allows you to be stable as you're working through it. This is why people say, hey, are you there yet? You're not triggering anything because you know that that's your picture out into the future, like the vision. So that's mental rehearsal. Outcome visualization, end state. You can take a screenshot. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. We covered these in another session. Process visualization, execution, obstacle and coping. They call this WOOP, wish outcome obstacle plan. WOOP, W-O-O-P, wish outcome obstacle plan. And you can see where it breaks down. This fails when people rehearse obstacles cognitively but never rehearse the state. And this is what I was talking about. People get caught up in seeing the obstacle, and that becomes bigger than life. And if you think about worry is focusing on the obstacles. Worry is focusing on what's going to happen. You're visualizing. Just called negative visualization. You're visualizing the disaster. You're visualizing a thing you don't want. This is why what people worry about often comes to pass. And then you have identity visualization, and this is what I was just talking about. So identity visualization rehearsal fails, or identity rehearsal fails when it's aspirational instead of behavioral. What I mean by this is that the outcome, yes, that's what you want, but what you're going to visualize to be practical is the on-ramp. So you can visualize the steps of the on-ramp. You can visualize the steps you're going to take over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. But you don't have to necessarily visualize in detail that outcome. It's more of a sensing. It's more of an awareness of it. And then during that deep inner work is where you're visualizing the steps of the on-ramp, but you know that that outcome is what you're doing. This is separating between mental rehearsal and visualization. And then deep practice visualization is more precision and reps. This is how we build habits. Deep practice fails when reps are vague, inconsistent, or emotionally flat. So what you want to do is improve the speed, reliability, and handoff. It's intense. You keep the practice session short, and you want to make sure that you are making corrections very quickly because you're leveraging the dopamine habit formation in this deep practice. And in physical deep practice, I would say there's 7 factors: novelty, keeping it new; intention, precision; balance or complexity; progression; explosiveness, intensity burst if it's cognitive; and then struggle at the edge of ability. When you're doing that, it communicates to the brain and nervous system that this is important, and that's how you start getting myelin wrapped around the neurons, making them the path of least resistance, making them the habit. And this is why it's possible to build at the habit level rapid recovery. And because the network of neurons operate in millions of bits per second, that's why it's possible at the millisecond level, because you're using habitual automaticity. You're not needing the conscious mind. The conscious mind can then be left free at its slow 50 bits per second to deal with the really big important stuff. So there's the types of mental rehearsal: visual, emotional, linguistic. So it's not all just visual, it's mental rehearsal. And you don't have, this is not something you have to know, it's just the points that come up so we have a common language, because depending on where your sticking point is in that seven-step reset, we use different drivers and levers and having a common language. So these end up going into some of that knowledge, but it doesn't happen overnight. This is part of a 90-day transformation program, and these are the tools we're using over those 90 days. So you have to have some common language, which is why I want to have a presentation that people can go to watch, because it's foundational, and everybody doesn't need every single thing in this presentation, but there are parts that apply, and you'll pull out what you need. Strategies, structured protocols, implementation intentions I just covered. If this happens, I'm going to do that. And then the mental contrasting is keeping those two things. Here's the outcome I want, these are the obstacles. And also the other part of mental contrasting could be, this is what I want, and this is what happens if I don't get it. But we don't want to make these pictures too big. We don't want to make the picture so big and bright of what we don't want that it overpowers the other one. These are just reference points that, yeah, I'm doing this and this is my motivation. It's sort of like moving away from. There's more motivation moving towards something because you have the passion and all that, but fear moves away from things more vigorously. Long-term purpose objectives, you need them moving towards, but that fear motivation can attack with vigor, because the fear gets associated with other things that are scary, and everything becomes a tiger on the Serengeti, proverbially. And then deep practice, precision reps for automaticity. Deep practice is essentially what you use if you're building muscle memory. If you play a sport and you're working on a specific skill, you're probably using deep practice. The point is, the same way neural pathways work to move your muscles and engage, they work cognitively as well. That's the big aha, that all of that stuff, it's not a mind, it's the network of neurons. You just have to learn to apply it to cognitive processing. Mental rehearsal is more than visualization. Most manifestations are really preparation, priming, and better responses under pressure. It's not magic. It's not just pictures. It's not vague. In the moment, you don't rise to intention. You fail to what you rehearsed, and that's your conditioning. And you know how important conditioning is when you talk about muscle memory. We want to apply that to cognitive as well. This is what happens when you do steps 7, 1, and 2 well. 7, 1, and 2. 7, 1, and 2. 7, 1, and 2. When you don't do them well, your reaction becomes the stimulus for the next stimulus response cycle. This is why when a person is acting in a phobia or when they're in fear mode, it's happening so rapidly and there's no time for any kind of rational conversation. This is not recovery. This is recovery, and we're going to make this recovery so fast you don't even notice that the person fell off course. So self-mastery is not a personality trait. It's a set of trained capabilities. Purpose sets long-term direction. Identity shapes daily decisions. Habits create the automatic execution, and feedback loops drive continuous improvement. So when I mentioned in the introduction that we've gone from preparation and planning to have great execution, and now it's more feedback loops, and this is what you have to be comfortable with. You have to have agency and personal leadership, because in these feedback loops you're going to get bad news, you're going to have setbacks, and you can't let them impact you and have you thinking that things are not going to work. How to create this shift. Change becomes sustainable when identity, state, and practice align. So you want to get the identity aligned, and that's that deep inner work. That's what we do over the 90 days. Coherence and regulation becomes a habit, because when you don't have coherence, you have chaos and rigidity, and those two don't work well when you're getting a scary stimuli coming. Iterative deep practice. We're going to do the deep practice at the failure points. So if you're playing a piano piece, you're going to practice the whole piece, but the focus, the deep practice work, is on the 20 seconds that you're struggling with, or the 40 seconds that you're struggling with. It's got to be quick, repetitious, and a 5-minute intense thing where you can do this thing backwards and frontwards and slow and fast, and that's how you apply the deep practice, because you're wrapping those moves with myelin, those neurons that drive the moves with myelin. That's the same way we do with things, whether it's selling or business or what have you, communication. Deep practice trains reliability so that behavior holds under pressure. Now, it's not holding under pressure because you're strong and suppressing it. It's holding under pressure because you're recovering so fast. Training reliability, not insight. Small, precise steps, reps with high attention, and error correction, re-execution. This is so important because that's where the automaticity comes from. That's what looks like people are steady. So if you're looking at these like martial arts masters, yeah, they have the reaction formulating, but they don't let it become a response because they recovered. It's already taken care of at the habit level. And then deep practice, how to do it. Progress comes from short, precise repetitions, not intensity or volume. This is the misnomer. So when you're doing deep practice, you want to have little short bursts and focus, focus, focus. The same way you can imagine how a track coach is working with a sprinter. They're breaking the things down into little parts and getting perfection, or a football player or whatever, and then they pull them together. But that's a process, and it takes sometimes months. Short reps with immediate retry and immediate correction. That's where the dopamine starts to kick in. And it's exciting when you do it because it becomes a game. So, and you want to do it in like a flow, you want to be in a flow state. If you do too much, it gets to be overwhelmed. If you don't do enough, it gets boring. So you have to be in that zone of this is important and you're executing. Deep practice, target outcome. The goal is not calm. The goal is faster return and reduced volatility. That's how we get the micro recoveries and reduce swings under pressure. Consistent behavior across context. Seemingly constant regulation. So it looks constant to the naked eye, but what's really going on, if you can look at the nervous system level, is constant recovery. It's the same way when you're driving around a curve and maybe it's a bumpy road, you're constantly adjusting. You're not letting those bumps throw you off the road. You're staying in the lane. So if somebody's watching you, the arc of your car going around that curve looks consistent and constant. But if you look at the steering wheel, it's back and forth. It's back and forth. Deep practice amplifiers. Constraints and feedback accelerate wiring more than repetition alone. So by having that instant feedback, sometimes you can use a camera, but that's why you want to keep it short, because you don't want to deal with that failure point 20 minutes later when you finish the piece. You want to deal with it right away. This is why we keep it fast. The constraints could be time, silence, limits, speed, doing it in the dark, different things. Practice during mild stress. You don't want to practice when you're stressed out, because remember, the learning is very hard when you're stressed. Learning is much faster when you're divergent, not when you're converging into something. And of course, I said immediate feedback several times, and frequency over duration. Identity visualization, target outcome. So we won't spend time on the identity piece. I did cover that, but this is the result is internal stability that reduces external disruption. That was the stability I was talking about. So let's take a look here. We're going to... So the 4 pillars of self-mastery: knowledge, direction and clarity; habit mastery, automatic execution. That's what makes rapid recovery possible; state mastery, coherence and recovery speed. The second part of what makes it possible. And you actually work on these both at the same time, because as you build more habits, you have to be able to do them in more difficult situations, and then you get to the end where you have the state mastery. And forgiveness is about performance hygiene. It's removing the potential for you to be triggered, like I used the example of seeing flowers and it reminds you of a breakup. We need to forgive ourselves and forgive others so we don't have those wounds just waiting to rise up again. That's what the forgiveness is about. And there's a process that we use to do that. This is more about performance. It's not about morality. And here's the picture I drew. And here's the barrier, right? This is what makes it hard. Bad experiences, being cheated, habit patterns, all this stuff in the past, stories. We want to go from that to this. We're going to go through that inflection point, get through the barrier. This is the inner work. That's why you have to do inner work, because if you're 60 years old, you've probably been living with these same habits for 30 years. The inner work is not going to take 30 years. You can do the inner work in a year, 6 months. But you have to do that inner work to get through here, because up here, it's even worse. It's not that it's worse that you're getting more threats, but more things look like threats. Remember, the subconscious looks at the unfamiliar as a threat. So you're getting that all the time. Threats, opportunities, everything looks scary. And that's why you have to have the rapid recovery and the agency and the personal leadership. There's another slide saying the same thing. I do these events daily, so it's usually 7 o'clock, Monday to Fridays, on Facebook and YouTube. You can go to 7stepreset.com/live to get those other platforms. And then on Friday, I'll come on LinkedIn and usually do a summary. But watch in February, I'll start an Ask Me Anything on Wednesday morning, because in February and March, we'll be talking about leadership, and this makes it real. So there are people out there who, every day as a leader, you have something that you're working on. That's why we have the Ask Me Anything. We're applying these principles real time using dynamic leadership concepts, using the dynamic leadership curriculum content to help people navigate these current situations that they're going through. And I'm also doing a workshop on the 4 pillars of self-mastery on February 12th. February 12th, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And you can go to that website on the bottom, 7steptransformation.com, self-mastery 2, and there's hyphens in it. And that's wrap. That's a wrap for the wrap-up. This is a lot in this one. I recommend watching it a few times. You can go over and over. You can do laps around this, but this is the work we do in the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional to get to that point where you have agency and personal leadership, even when there's chaos all around you. All right, we'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll start in on the one-to-one leadership, and I'll start off with designing your quest, because you want to have clarity around your quest in such a way that you can do this work towards it. And we talk about how do you start that quest, how do you design that quest so that it supports where you need to be with your identity, self-mastery, etc. All right, we'll see you.